All right, so, of course, we left off here, and this, of course, is Salisbury Cathedral. It is one of the 3 locations in the United Kingdom where you can see an original document of the Magna Carta, which, of course, is that fundamental document signed in 1215 by the king at Runnymede, which, of course, established the basic principle of the idea that subjects had a right to have some level of voice and representation in policies such as taxation and governance. And it is the Magna Carta that, of course, gives rise to the emergence of Parliament in the following century. And again, Parliament emerges largely because of a need for the monarch to raise taxes, largely for wars and so forth. But these important Middle Age developments help to give rise to parliamentary monarchy and representative government of the modern world, which, of course, today in the Western world is really the standard for governing structures, representative governments. And in that sense, remember the conversation of, was the Middle Ages a dark age? And ultimately, while you had many components like a lack of literacy, short lifespan, lack of urban development and so forth, lack of educational opportunity, et cetera, the reality is that it was still an era, the Middle Ages is still an era that had some really important developments occurring and was, as a result of that, very significant to the emergence of the modern world. And the modern world very much owes the historical roots of representative government to the Middle Ages, developments like the Magna Carta. Now, if you are fortunate enough to have, as some of you have, traveled in or lived in Europe, you've seen Gothic cathedrals, almost certainly. And Gothic cathedrals were really the first and most true architectural innovation and engineering innovation of the Middle Ages. The earlier Romanesque architecture, which the Romanesque style cathedrals are smaller than the Gothic ones, largely because of the engineering styles used in these structures. The Romanesque was sort of a fusion of earlier techniques with some Middle Age developments, but the Gothic cathedrals were in many ways truly a true Middle-aged form of architecture, and they are some of the most impressive structures still to this day. What makes a Gothic cathedral were building innovations centered largely on the usage of things called vaulted ceilings and flying buttresses. And I'm going to show you what these are. So, of course, in the world of Gothic cathedral, the Cathedral of Notre Dame is the most significant. And here you see in Paris the famous Cathedral of Notre Dame here in Paris. And I have a little video that I will probably show everyone in this class about this cathedral. But this cathedral is really, and it evolved, of course. It started as a much smaller style structure and was built on until it took the sort of monumental form that the cathedral here of Notre Dame in Paris, has taken. And this is your kind of classic Gothic cathedral. And Gothic cathedrals are associated with large stained glass windows, incredibly high walls with massive arching ceilings. And it's the vaulted ceilings and the flying buttresses that make these types of things possible. Looking inside to such cathedral structures, up here is where you see the vaulted ceilings. Okay, these huge, massively high structures, and the sound acoustics in these buildings are pretty amazing, actually. These structures, again, and they tell you a lot about the age of these types of structures because they are so massive. First of all, it tells you, one, who held the power during the Middle Ages. The reality is, as you see here on the screen on the left, the cathedral from Bayou in Normandy, and this cathedral is actually where William the Conqueror was coronated. Now, The power during the Middle Ages was really held more than anything else, not by secular kings, but rather through the church. And the church was really the preeminent political power. It was the vehicle through which people in society sort of understood and knew the world. So because knowledge, truth, belief, the afterlife, those types of things were controlled by the church, it was really the church that really had the greatest power during the Middle Ages. And kings really, really owed much of their ruling power, to some extent, through the church. So one, Gothic cathedrals tell you something about political authority during the Middle Ages, but it also tells you that this is not just a dark age. This is not just a period where nothing significant's happening. This is a period where there are massively impressive and monumental building projects that are undertaken, innovations in construction that are undertaken. And so in that respect, it just remains an incredibly significant period of history, and one that very much charts the path to the modern world. Indeed, today, if you go to any old European city, you will find a cathedral like this. And it is something to be noted that these cathedrals really, in many cases, remain the most impressive structures in many European cities to this day, owing to this kind of incredible development. Now here, this is the Duomo of Milan, and this was completed a little bit more recently, but nonetheless, the Duomo of Milan, which is one of the largest cathedrals in Italy, the Duomo of Milan gives you a really good example of those flying buttresses. So if I go back, we'll just go back one slide here. If you look here and you see the vaulted ceilings, what make these ceilings possible are these structures out here. And these like arms are the buttresses. And the buttresses are able to hold up these really tall, sort of thin, relatively speaking, these tall walls, stone walls, are then held up by these flying buttresses that then allow you to create these arching vaulted ceilings that gives the individual in the cathedral a sense of the sublime because they are so high. It gives you a sense of the towering and awesomeness of the place you're in, as well as an incredible place to display stained glass windows and a place for the sounds of singing and music. And just generally the impressive nature of these types of structures. The Duomo of Milan gives you, and it's hard to take these photos actually, because when you get up on the roof, you see the Duomo here, you can go up on the roof of the Duomo, and you can see the flying buttresses up close and personal. I tried to shoot some video there, and I was unsuccessful because there are some sites that they do not want you shooting video, largely because they want people to pay for the rights to shoot video. But I was able to get some photos that I think are excellent examples of sort of what buttresses kind of look like. They're these long arms that sort of hold up the walls and make those vaulted ceilings possible. Now, I also want to talk about, we're going to come back in our next segment, we're going to come back to discussing the political power of the Catholic Church. But first, I want to talk a little bit about changes in the nation states in Europe, changes in conflict in Europe, and also some fundamental changes setting up a really, really cataclysmic demographic shift in Europe. And we'll be associating that with the Black Death. But before we do that, one of the key factors in leading to the tumultuous era that becomes associated with the Black Death was a period of long-term war. It wasn't just that the Black Death was this global plague that came through the trade routes, the interconnections of the world, but Europe was very vulnerable to it. And part of the reason Europe was vulnerable to it was from long-term warfare going on at the time. And one of the most perfect examples of that, because of course, during wars, it should be noted, wars result in much of the population, the male population, going off to fight rather than being involved in the economy of farming and so forth. Wars typically result in a great deal of destruction of farmlands, and so agricultural productivity goes down, which causes for people's diets to worsen, which causes for the vulnerability of disease. This is a picture or painting. This is a painting, a picture of a painting of King Edward III, the King of England, counting the dead after the Battle of Crécy during the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was a conflict between the kings of France and the Norman kings of England, and it lasted until 1453. And it's generally broken up into 3 or 4 phases. The phase where King Edward III was king is sometimes called the Edwardian Phase. King Edward, during this phase, King Edward was a highly successful king for England, actually. Edward III was one of the longest ruling English monarchs. He ruled for some 50 years. And his campaign in the 100 Years' War was very successful. Even though the 100 Years' War, ultimately, the 100 Years' War is a conflict that the English kings lose. And eventually the war will end with a renunciation of any English claim to lands in France. So how did this conflict start? The 100 Years' War, and it lasts longer than 100 years, by the way. It's called the 100 Years' War because it occurs over a span of time that is between 2 centuries, but it's actually slightly longer than 100 years. And it's really, again, broken up into several phases. It's not continuous war. And so at the end of the Edwardian phase, you would have a peace agreement. And in the peace agreement, there would obviously be a ceasefire, and there would be various agreements made to accept, the peace of that conflict. So one of the agreements that Edward III made at the end of the Edwardian phase was that he renounced his rightful claim to what he felt was a rightful claim to the French crown. Now, he hadn't renounced all claims to English lands in France, but he renounced claims to be the rightful heir to France. So what caused this dispute? Remember, Norman kings, they come from Normandy, they possess lands in France, and the French monarch, who controlled the lands in and around, large lands, of course, in and around the areas where Paris is today, but large domains, of course. The French king had died without an heir, and Edward III was, through marriage, effectively married into the French royal family. And so Edward III claimed a right to be the King of England. And so there's this dispute over the crown of France. It also turns into a dispute over lands that are controlled in France. And again, it's several phases. The Edwardian phase, which you see, again, King Edward here counting the dead at this battle, this results in certain agreements. Edward III renouncing his claim to the French throne, though they maintain, again, possessions in France, lands in France. And then there's other conflicts that are fought more over possessions in France. This conflict is not fought in England. It's fought on the continent of Europe, the main continent of Europe. So there's a distinction between Great Britain's and Ireland. So the 100 Years' War is associated not only with these political disputes between the King of England, the French kings, not only to claims of land as well, but when these conflicts, these series of conflicts really comes to an end, you start to see the formation of something that looks more like the national identities that you come to associate with England and France. So it's at the end of this conflict where you start to see the identity of France as being exclusively on the continent, and the identity of England as being a country off the continent, the island, if you will. We know it's technically part geographically of the continent, but typically England draws a distinction between the continent itself. And so you start to see from this conflict a formation, if you will, of more modern national identities about what is England, and what is France. This conflict, and this is kind of I want to make a little. This is kind of a funny little story about this conflict. One of the most, I guess, memorable battles from this war was the Battle of Agincourt, which was fought in 1415 in the later phases of the conflict. And this is a conflict. This is a battle that pitted the King of England, of course, against the King of France. And in this war, the English relied largely on longbowmen. To be a longbowman in the English military at this time was like a really advanced skill. It required training from a young age to be able to wield a longbow. It was largely used in long-distance missile combat to rain arrows down upon your opponents fighting on the field of battle below. The English tended to use crossbows, which were a shorter a shorter range type of weapon. And in the Battle of Agincourt, the French soldiers had threatened that in the victory that they would sever the draw finger of the English soldiers, the longbowmen. Not all their soldiers are longbowmen, but they threatened to sever the fingers of their longbowmen. And the legend is a legend that your number one salute, the middle finger, the profane gesture that you should never give to anyone driving down the interstate, lest you receive the ire of road rage. But the legend is in the battle, Agincourt was fought in this kind of low field with hills on either side, and it had recently been plowed, and it had rained, and it was kind of muddy. And the French soldiers tended to be more heavily armored. They were weighted down more than many of the English soldiers. And in the battle, they fought in these close confines, and the French soldiers became weighted down. They sank into the mud. They had difficulty moving, and they were vulnerable to the longbowmen's arrows. And the result was a pretty crushing victory for the English. And the legend is that all the English longbowmen then turned around and gave the French the bowman's finger, which would then be the profane gesture known as the middle finger, the universal salute for your number one, if you will, that you should never use driving down the interstate against anyone. But it's just a legend. We don't really know that happened, but it's a myth that sometimes is funny to think about from the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. This conflict, and we'll finish up the slide in a moment, this conflict also does witness, as you see in other parts of the world, like with the sieges of Constantinople in 1453, the city that is now known as Istanbul in the old Byzantine Empire, you see a transformation of warfare. You've seen a shift away from the heavily armored knight to the castle over centuries-long war, as you see increasingly the slow implementation of more powerful weapons and gunpowder weapons that, while they were not terribly significant in this particular war, they do in other conflicts, like in the siege of Constantinople in 1453, you start to see a change in warfare. And you start to see gunpowder weapons and the usage of cannons rendering the old sort of structures like castles such as this really irrelevant to the firepower of gunpowder weapons, which of course was a product of the global interconnection of the world, as those weapons had come from China, transferred into the hands of Islamic empires, and eventually up into the European world. But again, this is a conflict that very much shapes the identities, the national identities of France and England. Eventually, England loses this, losing control over their possessions. In France, you see a transformation in warfare, as well as something that very much sets up the coming of the Black Death in Europe.